The capitulation that President Trump posted on Truth Social at 6:32 a.m. Washington time Monday morning is not being described as capitulation in the statement itself. It is being framed as a pause for productive diplomacy, a 5-day postponement of military strikes against Iranian power plants based on what Trump characterizes as very good and productive conversations regarding a complete and total resolution of our hostilities in the Middle East. The 48-hour ultimatum that was supposed to force Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz or face the obliteration of its electrical infrastructure has been canceled. Not because Iran opened the waterway, not because Iran capitulated to American demands, because Trump, faced with the operational consequences of executing the threat he issued, chose retreat over execution. And the framing of that retreat as diplomatic progress cannot obscure what the timeline of the past 72 hours actually documents. The pattern that this represents is one that observers of Trump's decision-making across decades have documented repeatedly enough that it has acquired its own terminology. Trump taco. The dramatic threat issued with maximum rhetorical force, followed by the quiet withdrawal when the moment arrives to execute it, repackaged as strategic flexibility or diplomatic success. The sequence is consistent. The threat, the countdown, the opponent's refusal to yield. The retreat framed as something other than retreat. What makes this iteration of the pattern analytically significant is not that it happened again. What makes it significant is that it happened in the context of a war that has killed more than 1,500 Iranians, destroyed critical energy infrastructure across the Gulf, closed the world's most important oil choke point for 3 weeks, and produced an economic crisis that the International Energy Agency describes as worse than the oil shocks of the 1970s. I'm Dr. Michael Harrington, and now we're going to look carefully at what is happening in and around the Strait of Hormuz, what is confirmed, what is still uncertain, and what comes next. Before we begin, a quick disclaimer. This video is for informational and educational purposes only, and is not financial, legal, or investment advice. I'm analyzing publicly available information, and events may change. Please do your own research and consult professionals before making decisions. If you're finding value in this analysis, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Saturday night, 11:44 p.m. Washington time. Iran must fully open, without threat, the Strait of Hormuz within 48 hours, or the United States will hit and obliterate their various power plants, starting with the biggest one first. The deadline was explicit. The threat was unambiguous. The consequences for non-compliance were stated in terms designed to communicate finality. Iran's response was published Monday morning, 9 hours before the deadline expired. The National Defense Council announced that any attempt to strike Iranian territory would result in the mining of the entire Persian Gulf. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps published a target list, including the UAE's Barakah nuclear power plant, every desalination facility across the Gulf, and all energy infrastructure with American investment. Iran did not reopen the strait. Iran did not signal willingness to negotiate the terms Trump demanded. Iran escalated the threat framework to include consequences that would persist for months, even if both sides stopped firing immediately. Monday morning, 6:32 a.m. Washington time, 17 hours before the deadline Trump set was scheduled to expire. Based on the tenor and tone of these in-depth, detailed, and constructive conversations, which will continue throughout the week, I have instructed the Department of War to postpone any and all military strikes against Iranian power plants and energy infrastructure for a 5-day period, subject to the success of the ongoing meetings and discussions. The ultimatum was canceled. The threat was postponed. The deadline that was supposed to represent a line Iran could not cross without facing obliteration became a flexible timeline subject to ongoing conversations. Iranian state television did not frame Trump's announcement as diplomatic progress. IRIB broadcast graphics stating, Trump, fearing Iran's response, backed down from his 48-hour ultimatum. The semi-official Fars news agency, which functions as a communications platform for the Revolutionary Guards, reported that, after the Islamic Republic warned that if America attacks Iran's energy infrastructure, it will target energy infrastructure across the entire region, Trump retreats and said he had ordered a delay of the attack. The semi-official Mehr news agency use nearly identical language. Iran's framing of the sequence is transparent. Trump threatened, Iran counter-threatened with consequences. Trump was unwilling to accept. Trump retreated. The Revolutionary Guard's Telegram channel published a statement declaring that Trump's postponement proves the deterrence power of the Islamic Republic and demonstrates that the enemy has understood the cost of any aggression against Iran's vital infrastructure. The operational question that Trump's retreat raises is not whether issuing ultimatums and then canceling them when the deadline approaches represents effective diplomacy. The record on that question is clear across multiple decades of documented instances. The question is, what message this particular retreat sends to the governments, militaries, and populations watching this conflict about the credibility of American threats and the resolve behind American military operations. The United States has been bombing Iran for 24 days. 8,000 military targets struck, according to Central Command. 130 Iranian vessels destroyed. Iran's tactical fighters not flying, its navy not sailing, its offensive capacity degraded beyond recognition, according to Admiral Brad Cooper's assessment delivered to NBC News Sunday. And yet, when Trump issued an ultimatum demanding Iran reopen the Strait of Hormuz or face the destruction of its power plants, the response he received was not capitulation, but a counter-threat to mine the Persian Gulf and strike American energy infrastructure across the region. That response, delivered by a country whose military the United States has spent 3 weeks systematically degrading, was sufficient to cause Trump to cancel the deadline he had set and postpone the strikes he had threatened. The gap between the official assessment of Iranian military capacity as approaching irrelevance and Iran's demonstrated capacity to issue threats that Trump considers credible enough to avoid executing his own ultimatum describes a strategic picture where words and operational reality exist in incompatible spaces. The financial markets responded to Trump's retreat with the kind of surge that reveals what the previous week of trading had been pricing in. S&P 500 futures, which were down more than 1% before Trump posted, surged nearly 3%. NASDAQ 100 futures jumped 3%. Dow futures climbed 1,000 points. The relief rally that Trump's cancellation of the power plant threat triggered describes a market that had been anticipating catastrophic escalation and is now recalculating based on the assessment that the immediate crisis has been deferred. Brent crude dropped from $114 per barrel to levels below $110. Natural gas futures declined. Energy stocks that had surged on supply disruption fears pulled back. The market response is rational if the assessment is that Trump's retreat reduces the immediate risk of strikes that would have triggered Iranian mining operations, infrastructure attacks, and complete closure of what remains of Gulf shipping capacity. The market response becomes more complex if the assessment is that Trump's pattern of issuing threats and then retreating when faced with the consequences of executing them has now been demonstrated in a military context, where credibility determines whether future threats produce compliance or defiance. Every government watching this sequence now has operational evidence that American ultimatums, even those issued in the context of active warfare, are subject to cancellation if the target demonstrates willingness to escalate rather than capitulate. The diplomatic conversations that Trump references as justification for postponing the strikes have not been confirmed by Iranian officials. Iranian state media explicitly deny that negotiations are taking place, framing Trump's postponement purely as retreat under pressure, rather than as progress toward resolution. The claim of productive conversations occurring over the past 2 days that have produced movement toward a complete and total resolution of our hostilities is being made by one side and denied by the other. That pattern is consistent with previous Trump taco sequences, where the diplomatic progress justifying the retreat exists primarily in Trump's characterization, rather than in documented agreements or mutual statements. The strategic logic problem that the retreat creates extends beyond the immediate question of Hormuz and power plants to every subsequent decision point in this conflict. If Iran can cause Trump to cancel an ultimatum by threatening consequences Trump is unwilling to accept, the deterrence framework shifts. Future American threats will be assessed by Iran through the lens of this sequence: issue threat, receive counter-threat describing unacceptable escalation. Watch America postpone or cancel. That assessment framework does not incentivize Iranian compliance with American demands. It incentivizes Iranian defiance backed by credible threats of escalation beyond what American decision-makers are willing to manage. The USS Boxer, carrying thousands of Marines, continues its transit toward the Persian Gulf. The deployment that was announced as the ultimatum was being issued has not been canceled alongside the ultimatum. The contradiction between postponing strikes against Iranian power plants while continuing to deploy ground forces toward a theater where the adversary has just demonstrated the capacity to force American retreat through threatened escalation describes a decision-making structure operating without coherent integration between political signaling and military deployment. The Marines are still coming. The deadline is canceled. The strategic logic connecting those two facts is unclear. Admiral Brad Cooper stated Sunday that Iran could stop this war right now, absolutely, if they chose to do so, by ceasing missile and drone launches. That assessment was delivered approximately 36 hours before Trump canceled the ultimatum that was supposed to force Iranian compliance through threatened destruction of power plants. The gap between Cooper's assessment that Iran can simply choose to end the war by stopping its retaliation and Trump's decision to cancel his own deadline rather than execute the threat describes a disconnect between military assessment and political decision-making that extends beyond normal civil-military differences in risk tolerance. The 71st wave of Iranian attacks that struck Monday morning, hours before Trump canceled his deadline, included missiles and drones targeting Israeli cities, American bases across the Gulf, and Saudi energy infrastructure. Iran did not reduce its operational tempo as Trump's deadline approached. It did not signal interest in de-escalation. It continued executing the same pattern of attacks that have characterized the past 3 weeks, while simultaneously threatening to mine the Persian Gulf if Trump executed his power plant strikes. That operational picture, continued offensive operations combined with escalation threats, was sufficient to produce Trump's retreat. The casualty toll continues to accumulate in ways that the postponement of power plant strikes will not reverse. 1,500 Iranians killed, more than 200 of them children. 1,029 Lebanese killed, 15 Israelis killed, 60 Iraqis killed. The humanitarian consequences of 3 weeks of sustained bombing and missile exchanges are not paused because Trump postponed a specific category of strikes. The hospitals treating wounded from Saturday's Dimona and Arad attacks remain at capacity. The 180 people injured in those strikes are still being treated. The families displaced by infrastructure destruction are still displaced. The economic disruption that forced the International Energy Agency to warn of a crisis worse than the 1970s continues. What Trump's retreat does not address is the fundamental problem that produced the ultimatum in the first place. The Strait of Hormuz remains closed. Western shipping remains absent from the waterway. Oil prices remain elevated. The energy crisis that Trump attempted to resolve through threatened destruction of Iranian power plants has not been resolved by the cancellation of that threat. It persists. And the operational pattern that Iran has now demonstrated, credible escalation threats producing American retreat, does not create incentives for Iran to reopen the waterway without extracting concessions that the United States has shown no willingness to provide. The 5-day postponement that Trump announced is described as subject to the success of the ongoing meetings and discussions. If those discussions do not produce success by Friday, the logical next step would be execution of the previously threatened strikes. But the pattern documented over 72 hours suggests a different trajectory. The threat, the deadline, the opponent's refusal, combined with escalation threats, the retreat framed as diplomatic flexibility. If that pattern repeats, Friday will produce not strikes against Iranian power plants, but another postponement, another characterization of productive conversations, another extension of a timeline that was initially described as non-negotiable. The summary of what Day 24 of this conflict produced before the deadline expired is not diplomatic breakthrough producing movement toward resolution. It is Trump taco executed in a military context where the stakes involve thousands of lives, global energy markets, and the credibility of American threats. The ultimatum was issued. Iran refused and escalated. Trump retreated. The pattern is familiar. The context is unprecedented. And the operational consequence is that every government, ally, and adversary now has documented evidence that American ultimatums in this war are subject to cancellation when faced with credible threats of consequences the administration is unwilling to accept. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. When Friday arrives and the 5-day postponement expires, the analysis of whether Trump executes the strikes he twice threatened or issues a third postponement will be here. When Iran's operational response to Trump's demonstrated pattern of retreat takes form in future escalation decisions, the analysis will be here. When the next ultimatum is issued and the question becomes whether anyone believes it will be executed, the analysis will be here. This channel documents the gap between what officials say and what the evidence shows, connects the rhetoric of ultimatums to the operational reality of retreat, and tells you what the pattern actually reveals about decision-making under pressure. Leave one question in the comments. Does issuing ultimatums and then canceling them when the deadline approaches represent strategic flexibility in pursuit of diplomatic resolution, or does it represent a documented pattern of retreat that undermines the credibility of every subsequent threat? Every response gets read.